Something extraordinary just happened at Buckingham Palace, something that hasn't occurred in British politics for generations. King Charles has just blocked a major government bill, and Prime Minister Keir Starmer walked out of the palace meeting in what witnesses are describing as barely controlled fury. This isn't a constitutional formality. This isn't the king politely suggesting amendments. This is a direct confrontation between the crown and the government, and it's exploding right now. Sources inside the palace are confirming that the meeting, which was supposed to last an hour, ended after just 20 minutes. Starmer didn't say goodbye. He didn't follow protocol. He simply left, his face like thunder, his team scrambling to keep up. And here's what makes this absolutely explosive. The bill that Charles blocked isn't some minor piece of legislation. It's central to Labour's entire agenda. Without it, Starmer's government falls apart. And the king knows it. This is a constitutional crisis unfolding in real time, and what happens next could change Britain forever. Let's be absolutely clear about what we're witnessing here. The monarch blocking government legislation is supposed to be impossible in modern Britain. It's the kind of thing that happened centuries ago, back when kings actually ruled rather than reigned. The whole point of constitutional monarchy is that the crown stays out of politics, rubber stamps what Parliament decides, and maintains a dignified silence on matters of government policy. That's the deal. That's how it's worked for generations. But King Charles just tore up that rule book. He didn't politely express concerns through back channels. He didn't suggest the government reconsider certain aspects. He flat out refused to give royal assent, the formal approval needed for any bill to become law. And in doing so, he's triggered something that nobody in Westminster was prepared for. The bill in question is Labour's controversial Digital Identity and Rights Act, a sweeping piece of legislation that would fundamentally reshape how British citizens interact with government services, banking and public infrastructure. Starmer's government has been pushing it hard, claiming it's essential for modernisation, for security, for bringing Britain into the digital age. But critics have been screaming from the rooftops that it's an Orwellian nightmare, a surveillance state dressed up in progressive language. They've warned about the erosion of privacy, the centralisation of personal data, the potential for government overreach on a scale never seen before in British history. And apparently King Charles has been listening to those warnings, not just listening, acting on them. Here's what actually happened in that meeting based on multiple sources who were either present or briefed immediately afterwards. Starmer arrived at the palace expecting a formality. His team had prepared talking points about the bill's benefits, statistics about public support, arguments about national security. They thought Charles might raise a few gentle concerns, the kind that could be addressed with minor amendments. They were catastrophically wrong. From the moment Starmer sat down, Charles made his position crystal clear. He had serious fundamental objections to the bill. He believed it violated basic principles of British liberty. He questioned whether Parliament had truly understood the implications of what they were voting for. And then came the bombshell: he would not grant royal assent. Starmer apparently tried everything in that room. He explained the political necessity. He emphasised the democratic mandate. He pointed out that the bill had passed both houses of Parliament. He reminded Charles that the monarchy doesn't interfere in elected government business, but Charles wouldn't budge. According to one source, the king said something along the lines of, "I have a constitutional duty to protect the realm and its people, and I cannot in good conscience approve legislation that I believe threatens fundamental freedoms." Those words, if accurately reported, represent the most direct political intervention by a British monarch in living memory. They're not just controversial, they're revolutionary. That's when things got heated. Starmer, never known for his patience when challenged, reportedly raised his voice. He told Charles that blocking the bill would create a constitutional crisis that could threaten the monarchy itself. He warned that Parliament wouldn't tolerate royal interference in democratic decisions. He suggested in barely veiled terms that Charles was overstepping his authority in a way that could have severe consequences. The atmosphere in the room became icy. Charles, according to witnesses, remained calm but immovable. He repeated his position. He referenced constitutional scholars who had warned about the bill's implications. He mentioned letters from concerned citizens, including former judges and civil liberties experts, and he made it clear that this wasn't a negotiation. That's when Starmer stood up and walked out. No handshake, no formal conclusion to the meeting, no adherence to the protocol that governs interactions between prime ministers and monarchs. He simply left his private secretary trying to smooth things over as they exited, but the damage was done. Within minutes, word was spreading through Westminster. The King had blocked the bill. Starmer had walked out. The constitutional order that Britain had relied on for over a century was suddenly in question, and nobody knew what would happen next. Now, you need to understand why this is so much bigger than just one bill. Royal assent is supposed to be automatic. The last time a monarch refused, it was in 1714, over 300 years ago. It's not even considered a real power anymore. It's a formality, a rubber stamp, a ceremonial recognition that Parliament has spoken. But Charles just demonstrated that it's not ceremonial at all. It's real, it's active, and it can be used to block elected governments when the monarch believes they're overstepping. That realisation is sending shockwaves through the entire political establishment. Because if Charles can block this bill, what else can he block? What other legislation might he decide violates his principles? How much power does the Crown actually have that everyone assumed had evaporated through disuse? Starmer's team is scrambling right now to figure out their next move. Constitutionally, they're in uncharted territory. There's no modern precedent for this situation, no playbook for how a Prime Minister responds when the King refuses to approve legislation. Some are arguing that Starmer should recall Parliament immediately, hold an emergency debate and force a constitutional confrontation. Others are suggesting he should try negotiation, find a compromise, amend the bill to address Charles's concerns. But there's a third group, and their advice is the most explosive of all. They're saying Starmer should use this crisis to question the monarchy's role entirely, to argue that an unelected king shouldn't have the power to override elected representatives, to start a conversation about whether Britain even needs a constitutional monarchy in the 21st century. The political fallout is already beginning, and it's more intense than anyone predicted. Within an hour of Starmer's walkout, Conservative MPs were holding emergency meetings. Some are backing Charles, arguing that he's right to question legislation that threatens civil liberties. Others are deeply uncomfortable remembering their own battles with royal interference during their time in government. The Reform UK party has come out swinging in support of the King, calling him a defender of British freedom against authoritarian overreach. They're already fundraising off this crisis, painting themselves as the only party that truly respects constitutional limits on government power. The Liberal Democrats are split, with some praising Charles's courage and others warning about the dangers of royal political intervention. But it's Labour's internal reaction that's truly fascinating. Remember, this is a party already dealing with an attempted rebellion against Starmer's leadership. This crisis gives his critics even more ammunition. They're arguing that Starmer's political incompetence has now dragged the monarchy into a constitutional showdown that could damage both institutions. They're questioning why he pushed such controversial legislation so aggressively without building proper consensus. And they're whispering that a more skilled Prime Minister would have seen this coming, would have engaged with the palace earlier, would have found a way to avoid this humiliating confrontation. The knives that were already out for Starmer just got sharper. Public reaction is splitting along fascinating lines. Polls conducted in the hours since news broke show that the country is almost perfectly divided. About 45% support Charles's decision, agreeing that the bill was dangerous and that someone needed to stop it. About 40% are furious, arguing that the King has no right to override democratic decisions. The remaining 15% are confused, unsure about what's even happening or why it matters. But here's what's really interesting. Younger voters are overwhelmingly against Charles, seeing this as proof that monarchy is incompatible with democracy. Older voters are more supportive, trusting Charles's judgment and appreciating what they see as a principled stand. This generational divide could have massive long-term implications for the monarchy's future. The international reaction is equally significant. American media is covering this as a bizarre constitutional quirk, struggling struggling to explain to their audience how an unelected king can block legislation in a modern democracy. European newspapers are watching nervously, wondering if this could inspire their own constitutional monarchs to take more active roles. Commonwealth nations are paying particularly close attention because whatever precedent Charles sets in Britain could ripple across every realm where he serves as head of state. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they're all dealing with their own debates about the monarchy's relevance, and this crisis is fuel for Republican movements in every one of those countries. Behind the scenes, constitutional experts are being consulted frantically by both sides. The questions they're grappling with are profound. Can Parliament actually force the King to grant royal assent? What happens if they pass the bill again and he refuses again? Can the government function if the monarch actively opposes its legislation? Some scholars are arguing that Charles is technically within his rights, that royal assent is a genuine power that has simply fallen into disuse rather than being formally abolished. Others contend that constitutional convention is just as binding as written law, and Charles has violated that convention in a way that's fundamentally illegitimate. There's no clear answer, which is exactly what makes this crisis so dangerous. Starmer faces an impossible choice in the coming days. If he backs down, if he withdraws the bill or amends it substantially to satisfy Charles's concerns, he looks weak. He proves that the elected government can be overruled by an unelected monarch. His own MPS will smell blood in the water, questioning why they should follow a leader who can't even get legislation past the king. His political authority, already fragile, would crater completely. But if he escalates this into a full constitutional confrontation, he risks tearing the country apart. He risks creating a crisis that could damage institutions that have held Britain together for centuries. And he risks losing because it's not at all clear that the public would side with him over the king. Charles, meanwhile, has his own calculations to make. He's taken a stand that he clearly believes is principled and necessary. But he's also opened himself up to attacks that could threaten the monarchy's future. Republican sentiment in Britain has been growing for years, especially among younger generations. This confrontation gives anti-monarchy activists the perfect ammunition. They can point to this moment and say, see, this is why we can't have kings and queens in a democracy. They can argue that Charles has proven the system is broken, that no one person should have the power to override the will of elected representatives. If Charles has miscalculated, if public opinion turns against him decisively, he could end up doing more damage to the crown than any external threat ever could. The media is having a field day with this story, and their coverage is shaping public perception in real time. Right-wing outlets are largely backing Charles, running stories about the bill's dangerous provisions, interviewing privacy advocates who warned about its implications. They're framing Charles as a brave defender of liberty standing against government overreach. Left-wing media is going the other way, questioning Charles's right to interfere, running pieces about the importance of democratic accountability. They're framing this as an unelected, privileged man trying to override the will of the people. The gap between these narratives is enormous, and it's pulling the country in opposite directions. What happens next depends on decisions being made right now in Downing Street and Buckingham Palace. Starmer has to decide whether to double down or back down. Charles has to decide whether to maintain his position or find a face-saving compromise, and Parliament has to decide whose side it's on in a fight that many of them never wanted. The smart money says there will be negotiations, backroom discussions where both sides try to find a solution that lets them claim victory. Maybe the bill gets amended to address some of Charles's concerns while preserving its core elements. Maybe there's a delay, a cooling off period where emotions can settle and rational discussion can occur. But maybe, just maybe, neither side blinks. And if that happens, Britain faces a constitutional crisis unlike anything seen in modern times. Let's talk about the precedent this sets, because that might be the most important aspect of all this. If Charles successfully blocks this bill, future monarchs will know they can do the same thing. Every controversial piece of legislation will have to be crafted with an eye toward royal approval. not just parliamentary majority. That fundamentally changes how British government works. It reintroduces a check on parliamentary power that everyone assumed had disappeared. Some people will argue this is a good thing, that Parliament has become too powerful and needs restraint. Others will say it's a disaster, that it gives unaccountable power to whoever happens to be born into the royal family. But nobody can deny that it's a fundamental shift in how Britain is governed. Let's talk about the precedent this sets, because that might be the most important aspect of all this. If Charles successfully blocks this bill, future monarchs will know they can do the same thing. Every controversial piece of legislation will have to be crafted with an eye toward royal approval, not just parliamentary majority. That fundamentally changes how British government works. It reintroduces a check on parliamentary power that everyone assumed had disappeared. Some people will argue this is a good thing, that Parliament has become too powerful and needs restraint. Others will say it's a disaster, that it gives unaccountable power to whoever happens to be born into the royal family. But nobody can deny that it's a fundamental shift in how Britain is governed. There's also the question of what this means for Charles's reign going forward. He's been king for just over 2 years and he's already in the biggest political fight of his life. If he wins this battle, he establishes himself as a monarch willing to use his powers actively, not just ceremonially. That could make him more respected by some, but also more controversial and divisive. If he loses, if he's forced to back down, he risks looking weak and ineffectual for the rest of his reign. Every future decision he makes will be seen through the lens of this moment. He's gambled his credibility on this fight and the outcome will define his entire kingship. For Starmer, this is make or break. He's already facing rebellion from his own MPs. He's already hemorrhaging public support. Now he's in a fight with the king that he never wanted and isn't prepared for. If he handles this badly, if he appears either too weak or too aggressive, his government might not survive. There are already whispers in Westminster about whether Labour should replace him before this crisis escalates further. The argument goes, bring in a new leader who doesn't have the baggage of this confrontation, someone who can rebuild relationships with the palace and reset the government's agenda. It's brutal political calculation, but in the current climate, it's being seriously discussed. The British public is watching all of this unfold with a mixture of fascination and concern. Many people are genuinely worried about where this leads. Constitutional stability has been one of Britain's great strengths for centuries. The idea that this stability could unravel over a single bill, over a single meeting gone wrong, is deeply unsettling. Others are energised by the drama, choosing sides and arguing passionately about who's right. Social media is exploding with debates about royal power, democratic accountability, civil liberties and constitutional law. It's actually getting people engaged with political and constitutional questions that normally bore them to tears. Whether that's a good thing or not remains to be seen. International observers are also drawing lessons from this crisis. In countries debating their own constitutional arrangements, this is being held up either as proof that monarchy is outdated or as evidence that constitutional checks on government power are valuable. Republican movements worldwide are pointing to this and saying, this is what happens when you give political power to hereditary rulers. Monarchist groups are countering, this is what happens when governments try to overreach. And it's good that someone can stop them. The debate is going global, with Britain's constitutional crisis becoming a proxy battle for larger questions about governance and accountability. What we're witnessing is history in the making. Regardless of how this resolves, regardless of who ultimately wins this confrontation, British politics will never be quite the same. The relationship between Crown and government has changed forever. The assumption that royal powers are purely ceremonial has been shattered. The question of where ultimate authority lies in the British Constitution has been reopened in a way that demands answers. And those answers will shape Britain for generations to come. This isn't just about one bill or one prime minister or one king. It's about fundamental questions of power, legitimacy and democracy. The next 72 hours are absolutely critical. Watch for official statements from Downing Street and the Palace. Watch for emergency parliamentary debates. Watch for legal opinions from constitutional scholars. Watch for polls showing how public opinion is shifting. Watch for any signs that either side is preparing to compromise or dig in further. Every piece of news, every leaked conversation, every public comment from politicians or royal insiders will matter. Because this situation is fluid, it's volatile, and it could tip in any direction depending on who makes the next move. This is unprecedented. This is extraordinary. This is a constitutional crisis that nobody predicted and nobody knows how to resolve. King Charles has blocked a major government bill and Prime Minister Starmer walked out of the palace in fury. The Crown and the government are now in open conflict. The stability that Britain has taken for granted is suddenly in question. And whatever happens next will echo through British history for decades to come. This is the moment when everything changed. This is the moment when the rules everyone thought they understood got torn up and rewritten. And we're all watching it happen in real time.